If a stranger ever grabs your hand and calls you their boyfriend, you have two choices: walk away or change both of your lives forever. Ethan Brooks never imagined he would test that impossible choice. The Crystal Harbor Charity Gala glittered beneath towering chandeliers, every polished marble floor reflecting wealth, power, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Ethan had only agreed to attend because his coworker insisted the event would help him forget the worst 6 months of his life. Instead, the moment he stepped into the ballroom, his stomach tightened. Ryan Carter was standing near the entrance, laughing with a group of investors as though nothing had happened between them. Ethan instinctively turned away, hoping the crowd would swallow him before Ryan noticed. It was too late. Their eyes met across the room. Ryan's confident smile slowly widened, and he began making his way through the guests with the quiet certainty of someone who believed every door would always open for him. Ethan's pulse hammered inside his ears. He had spent months rebuilding a peaceful life after ending that relationship, changing apartments, changing jobs, even changing his daily routine, yet somehow Ryan always found another reason to appear. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was supposed to be the beginning of moving forward. Instead, every carefully built wall inside him started crumbling. He slipped past a line of servers carrying sparkling cider and headed toward the quieter side of the ballroom, searching desperately for an exit. The orchestra continued playing while conversations floated through the air, completely unaware of the panic growing beneath Ethan's calm expression. Behind him, Ryan called his name. Ethan kept walking. The second time, Ryan's voice came closer. Guests began glancing between them with polite curiosity. Ethan knew exactly what Ryan wanted, a public conversation that would make leaving impossible without attracting even more attention. Then Ethan saw him. Alone near the panoramic windows overlooking the city skyline stood Vincent Moretti. Even people who had never met him recognized him instantly. His tailored black suit, composed posture, and effortless confidence created a quiet space around him where no one lingered longer than necessary. Rumors described him as the mysterious businessman who somehow ended every negotiation smiling while everyone else lost. Others whispered about connections no newspaper could prove. Whatever the truth was, nobody casually interrupted Vincent Moretti. Ethan's mind made the decision before logic could object. He crossed the ballroom, closed the final few feet, and gently slipped his trembling hand around Vincent's arm. The words escaped almost as a whisper. "Baby, there you are." For one impossible second, the entire world became silent. Ethan expected confusion. Maybe rejection. Instead, Vincent slowly turned his head and studied Ethan with unreadable grey eyes that revealed absolutely nothing. Then, to Ethan's complete disbelief, the corner of Vincent's mouth lifted into a calm, amused smile. Without pulling away, he placed one reassuring hand over Ethan's and looked directly toward the approaching Ryan. His voice remained smooth, quiet, and impossibly confident. "Play along." Ryan Carter stopped 3 steps away, his confident smile fading just enough to reveal uncertainty before he quickly recovered. He straightened the front of his expensive navy suit and forced an easy laugh that sounded convincing to everyone except Ethan. "Interesting," Ryan said, looking from Ethan to Vincent. "I did not know you had company tonight." Ethan felt every muscle in his body tense, but Vincent never removed his hand from Ethan's. Instead, he glanced down briefly, as though reassuring Ethan without speaking, before lifting his calm grey eyes toward Ryan. "That is because my personal life is not a public announcement," Vincent replied smoothly. His voice never rose above normal conversation, yet the surrounding guests instinctively lowered theirs. Ryan studied Vincent carefully. "I was actually hoping to have a private conversation with Ethan." Vincent tilted his head slightly. "You already are." Several nearby executives exchanged curious glances. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Moments earlier Ryan had approached with complete confidence. Now he found himself standing opposite the one man in the room whose reputation discouraged unnecessary arguments. Ryan laughed again, although this time it sounded noticeably thinner. "There seems to be some misunderstanding. Ethan and I have known each other for years." Vincent nodded once. I believe that. Ryan blinked, clearly expecting resistance rather than agreement. Vincent continued, people often know each other for years before realizing they should walk different paths. Ethan almost looked at him in surprise. The words sounded effortless, but they landed with remarkable precision. Ryan's jaw tightened before relaxing again. He turned toward Ethan instead. You disappeared without giving us a real chance to fix things. Ethan finally found his voice. I left because I already made my decision. Ryan took half a step closer, only to stop when Vincent casually shifted his stance, placing himself naturally beside Ethan without appearing confrontational. The movement was subtle enough to remain perfectly polite while making one fact unmistakably clear. Ethan was not standing alone anymore. Vincent smiled pleasantly. My boyfriend has answered your question. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Boyfriend. The single word echoed through his thoughts far louder than the orchestra playing across the ballroom. Ryan stared in disbelief. Your boyfriend? Vincent answered before Ethan could react. Yes. There was no hesitation. No elaborate explanation. Just one simple word delivered with complete confidence. The nearby conversations faded even further. Someone quietly whispered Vincent's name. Another guest discreetly pulled out a phone, likely sending messages before the evening had even ended. Ryan looked directly at Ethan, searching for any sign that this was an act. Ethan swallowed the nervousness rising inside him and forced himself to nod. Yes, he said softly. We are together. Ryan let out a slow breath and folded his arms. That happened rather quickly. Vincent gave an almost amused smile. Some decisions are surprisingly easy once you meet the right person. Ethan wondered whether Vincent realized how convincing he sounded. Ryan certainly noticed. His expression shifted. From frustration to calculation. Well, Ryan said carefully, I suppose congratulations are in order. Vincent inclined his head graciously. Thank you. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally Ryan offered Ethan one last look, one filled with unanswered questions and wounded pride rather than anger. Take care of yourself, he said before turning toward the exit. Ethan watched until Ryan disappeared beyond the ballroom doors, hardly believing the conversation had ended so peacefully. He released a breath he had been holding for what felt like forever. Only then did he remember he was still holding Vincent's arm. Embarrassment rushed over him. He immediately stepped back. I am so sorry, Ethan said quietly. I should never have dragged you into something like this. Vincent looked at the ballroom, where dozens of curious eyes instantly looked away the moment he glanced in their direction. A faint smile returned to his face. On the contrary, he said. It has been the most interesting 15 minutes I have had all month. Before Ethan could respond, a distinguished older man approached Vincent and offered a respectful nod. Sir, the board members are waiting upstairs. Vincent acknowledged him without taking his eyes off Ethan. Please inform them I will be a few minutes late. The older man appeared surprised but simply nodded and walked away. Ethan stared at Vincent in disbelief. You really do not have to keep pretending anymore. Vincent's smile became just a little wider. Who said I was pretending? Ethan stared at Vincent for several long seconds, convinced he had misunderstood what he had just heard. The orchestra continued playing somewhere behind them, glasses clinked softly across the ballroom, and conversations gradually returned to normal, yet it felt as though the rest of the evening had faded into the background. I appreciate everything you just did for me, Ethan said carefully. But you really do not have to continue this. Vincent accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server before offering another one to Ethan. Drink, he said calmly. Your hands are still shaking. Ethan looked down and realized Vincent was right. Embarrassed, he accepted the glass. Thank you. Vincent studied him with quiet curiosity. You are very polite for someone who just recruited a complete stranger into a fictional relationship. Ethan almost laughed despite himself. Trust me, that was not part of my evening plans. I assumed as much. Vincent took a slow sip before continuing. Tell me something honestly. Did you choose me because you recognized who I was? Ethan shook his head immediately. I recognized your face, but only because everyone seems to know who you are. I chose you because nobody looked brave enough to interrupt you. For the first time since they met, Vincent gave a genuine smile that reached his eyes. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice unless someone was watching closely, but it completely changed his expression. That may be the most honest answer I have received this year. Ethan finally allowed himself to breathe a little easier. The intimidating image he had built from newspaper articles and whispered rumors did not match the composed man standing beside him. Vincent was reserved, certainly, but there was also an unexpected warmth hidden beneath his calm exterior. Before Ethan could say anything else, several guests approached with practiced smiles. One after another they greeted Vincent, congratulated him on what they believed was his new relationship, and politely introduced themselves to Ethan. Every time Ethan attempted to explain, Vincent smoothly redirected the conversation without ever allowing the illusion to collapse. Within minutes, Ethan had shaken hands with business executives, charity organizers, and city officials whose names he immediately forgot. It felt surreal. When the small crowd finally dispersed, Ethan rubbed his forehead. I think half the city believes we are actually together now. Vincent glanced toward the ballroom entrance where photographers were quietly documenting the evening. Probably more than half. Ethan nearly choked on his drink. You are joking. I rarely joke. Ethan followed Vincent's gaze and noticed two photographers lowering their cameras after taking pictures from across the room. His stomach sank. Those photographs are going to spread everywhere. Yes, Vincent answered simply. Which means your former boyfriend is unlikely to bother you again in public. Ethan looked at him with growing confusion. You planned that? Vincent remained silent for a moment before answering. I recognized the way he approached you. People who ignore clear boundaries often become more persistent when they believe nobody is watching. Public certainty tends to discourage private persistence. Ethan slowly nodded. The explanation made uncomfortable sense. You have done more for me in 20 minutes than most people have done in months. Vincent set his empty glass onto a nearby tray. Perhaps. But there is another problem now. Ethan felt his heart sink again. What problem? Tomorrow morning, Vincent replied calmly, every major business publication and social media page covering tonight's gala will likely mention that I attended with someone nobody has ever seen before. Ethan blinked. That sounds like your problem, not mine. Vincent smiled faintly. It becomes your problem when reporters begin asking questions about the mysterious man standing beside me. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. I have a normal office job. I cannot suddenly become a headline. Vincent nodded thoughtfully. Exactly why we should stay one step ahead of everyone else. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Vincent reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed an elegant business card before placing it into Ethan's hand. Only a name, a phone number, and a simple silver crest appeared on the thick white card. Come to my office tomorrow at 9 o'clock, Vincent said. If we are going to convince the world that tonight was real, then we should establish the rules before the world invents its own story for us. Ethan looked down at the card, then back at Vincent, realizing that the impulsive decision he had made only minutes earlier had not ended when Ryan walked away. It had only just begun. The business card remained in Ethan's hand all the way home. He must have looked at it 20 times during the taxi ride, half expecting the elegant silver crest to disappear like the ending of an unbelievable dream. By the time he reached his apartment, the city skyline had faded into quiet midnight lights, but his phone had not stopped buzzing. Messages from co-workers, old classmates, and even distant relatives filled the screen. Someone had already uploaded photographs from the gala. There he was, standing beside Vincent Moretti with Vincent's hand resting comfortably over his own. Another photograph showed Vincent smiling at him, a rare expression that countless comments beneath the article claimed they had never seen before. The headlines varied, but they all carried the same question. Who was the mysterious young man beside Vincent Moretti? Ethan buried his face in a pillow and groaned. This was exactly the situation he had hoped to avoid. Across town, inside the top floor of the Moretti Group headquarters, the lights in Vincent's private office were still on well after midnight. A tall man wearing thin glasses entered without knocking, carrying a tablet filled with the evening's media coverage. The photographs are spreading faster than expected, he said. Vincent glanced briefly at the screen before returning his attention to the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. That was predictable. Your board members are requesting explanations. Vincent nodded once. They can wait until morning. The man hesitated before asking, should we begin looking into Ethan Brooks? Vincent remained silent for several moments. Only the facts, he answered at last. Employment history, public records, and anything that concerns his safety. Nothing invasive. The assistant nodded respectfully. Understood. By 8:30 the next morning, Ethan was standing across the street from Moretti Group headquarters, staring up at the 60-story glass tower. Employees in tailored business attire moved confidently through the revolving doors while luxury cars arrived one after another. Ethan suddenly questioned every decision that had brought him here. He worked as a graphic designer for a modest marketing agency. Meetings usually meant coffee in paper cups and brainstorming around folding tables. Nothing in his ordinary life had prepared him for entering one of the most influential companies in the city. Taking a slow breath, he crossed the street and stepped inside. Before he could introduce himself at reception, the receptionist smiled warmly. Good morning, Mr. Brooks. Mr. Moretti is expecting you. Ethan blinked. You already know who I am? Welcome, she replied politely, avoiding the question with professional grace. Within seconds another employee escorted him toward a private elevator requiring a security card that Ethan certainly did not possess. As the elevator climbed, he watched the city grow smaller through the glass walls. His nervousness returned with every passing floor. When the doors opened, the entire top level felt remarkably quiet. Natural light poured through enormous windows, soft music played somewhere in the distance, and shelves filled with books replaced the cold corporate atmosphere Ethan had expected. Vincent stood near a conference table, already dressed in another perfectly tailored charcoal suit, reading several newspapers spread neatly before him. Without looking up, he said, "You arrived 3 minutes early." Ethan smiled awkwardly. "I did not want to be late." Vincent finally looked at him. Good. That tells me something important. Ethan frowned. What does it tell you? Vincent folded one newspaper and slid it across the polished table. The front page displayed their photograph beneath a bold headline asking whether the city's most private businessman had finally found someone special. Vincent met Ethan's eyes with the same calm expression as the night before. It tells me we still have time to stay ahead of this story. Sit down, Ethan. Before we discuss anything else, we need to establish 4 simple rules. If either of us breaks even one of them, this arrangement will become far more complicated than either of us intends. Ethan lowered himself into the chair across from Vincent, trying to ignore the stack of newspapers displaying the same photograph from different angles. Seeing his own face printed beside one of the most recognizable businessmen in the country still felt surreal. Vincent remained standing for another moment before taking the seat. Opposite him with the calm confidence of someone who had already considered every possible outcome. The first rule, Vincent began, folding his hands on the table, is honesty. We do not need to tell everyone every detail of our lives, but we do not lie to each other. If a situation becomes uncomfortable or dangerous, we discuss it immediately. Ethan nodded. That sounds reasonable. The second rule is consistency. If reporters ask how we met, our answers cannot contradict each other. Ethan smiled nervously. That would probably help. Vincent slid a small notebook across the table. I asked my assistant to prepare a simple timeline based entirely on real events. We met at the charity gala. We enjoyed talking. We decided to spend more time together. Everything after that remains intentionally private. Ethan opened the notebook and blinked in surprise. It contained only a single page written in neat handwriting. That is all. The simplest stories are usually the easiest to remember. Ethan laughed quietly. You have clearly done this before. Vincent shook his head. Actually, I have not. Ethan looked up. Then how are you so calm? Vincent considered the question for a second. Because panic creates mistakes. Planning creates options. Before Ethan could answer, someone knocked softly on the office door. Vincent's assistant entered carrying 2 coffee cups and a digital tablet. Good morning, Mr. Brooks, he said politely. I am Daniel Foster. Ethan smiled. Nice to meet you. Daniel placed the coffees on the table before turning the screen toward Vincent. Media interest continues to increase. 3 television networks have requested interviews. Several magazines are asking for confirmation regarding your relationship. Vincent glanced at the screen without changing expression. Decline every interview. Understood. Daniel hesitated before adding, there is one more matter. Vincent looked at him. Ryan Carter has contacted the communications department twice this morning. He claims the public deserves to know the truth. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Vincent noticed immediately. Did he say what truth? Daniel shook his head. Only that he wishes to correct misinformation. Vincent thanked him, and Daniel quietly left the room. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Ethan stared into his untouched coffee. I never wanted any of this to happen. Vincent answered gently. I believe you. Ethan sighed. Ryan hates losing control of a situation. If people stop paying attention to him, he usually finds another way to become the center of the conversation. Vincent leaned back slightly. Then we should assume he will continue trying to contact you. Ethan nodded reluctantly. Probably. Vincent looked toward the city outside the windows before returning his attention to Ethan. Would you feel comfortable staying somewhere with additional privacy for a few days? Ethan frowned. You mean a hotel? My lakeside residence. Ethan's eyes widened. Absolutely not. Vincent did not appear offended. May I ask why? Ethan gave an awkward smile. Because we met less than 24 hours ago, and moving into your house sounds like something people would warn me about. To Ethan's surprise, Vincent laughed quietly. It was a genuine laugh, brief but unmistakable. A fair observation. Ethan relaxed a little, realizing he had not accidentally offended him. Vincent continued, then let us compromise. You stay in your own apartment. However, if reporters begin waiting outside your building or if Ryan continues creating unnecessary problems, you call me immediately. Day or night. Ethan looked at the business card still resting beside his notebook. Yesterday it had felt like an escape. Today it felt like the beginning of an unexpected partnership. He slipped the card carefully into his wallet and finally picked up his coffee. I never imagined one desperate decision at a charity gala would completely change my week. Vincent smiled with quiet certainty. I have a feeling it is going to change much more than that. 3 days passed more quietly than Ethan expected, but quiet did not mean normal. Every morning another article appeared online speculating about Vincent Moretti's mysterious relationship. Every afternoon someone at Ethan's office found a new excuse to ask harmless but increasingly curious questions. His co-workers respected his privacy, yet they could not hide their fascination. By Friday afternoon, Ethan's manager even joked that the company had never received so many visitors asking whether a certain graphic designer actually worked there. Ethan laughed politely, although the attention left him feeling uneasy. As promised, Vincent never overwhelmed him with constant messages. Instead, he sent one brief text every morning. Good morning. I hope your day goes smoothly. Every evening another message arrived. Did everything remain peaceful today? The conversations were surprisingly ordinary. Sometimes Ethan mentioned a difficult design project. Sometimes Vincent replied with a photograph of the sunrise over the lake outside one of his properties or an interesting quote from a book he happened to be reading. Without realizing it, Ethan began looking forward to those simple exchanges. Late Friday afternoon, just as Ethan was preparing to leave work, his phone vibrated. It was Vincent. "Are you available for dinner?" the message asked. Ethan hesitated before replying. "Is this part of the arrangement?" Vincent answered almost immediately. "Partly. Reporters have started asking why nobody has seen us together since the gala. Public consistency remains useful. Besides, I would simply enjoy having dinner with you." Ethan stared at the final sentence longer than he expected. There was something unexpectedly sincere about it. 30 minutes later, a black sedan waited outside his office building exactly as Vincent had described. Daniel stepped out with his usual professional smile. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks. Mr. Moretti asked me to drive you to the restaurant." During the 20-minute drive, Daniel spoke only when Ethan asked questions, but one answer stayed with him. "Has Mr. Moretti always been this thoughtful?" Ethan asked carefully. Daniel smiled to himself. "I have worked with him for almost 10 years. He has always cared deeply about people. He simply does not advertise it." The restaurant overlooked the river, tucked away from the busiest parts of downtown. There were no photographers waiting outside, no crowds gathering near the entrance, only soft lights reflecting across the water and quiet piano music drifting through the dining room. Vincent stood as Ethan approached the table. "Thank you for coming." Ethan smiled. "Thank you for inviting me." Dinner felt remarkably easy. They talked about favorite books, childhood memories, embarrassing first jobs, and places they still hope to visit one day. Ethan learned that Vincent loved restoring old libraries and secretly collected vintage fountain pens. Vincent discovered that Ethan spent weekends sketching city parks simply because drawing relaxed him. More than once they laughed at the same story, and each time Ethan caught himself forgetting why they had met in the first place. Halfway through dessert, Vincent looked toward the window overlooking the river. "May I ask you something personal?" Ethan nodded cautiously. "Of course." Vincent folded his hands around his coffee cup. "When you ran toward me that night, were you terrified?" Ethan answered honestly. "Yes." Vincent remained silent for several seconds before asking another question. "And now?" Ethan thought carefully before responding. "Not anymore." Vincent looked back at him. "Because Ryan has stopped contacting you." Ethan slowly shook his head. "No." A small smile appeared on his face. "Because somehow? I feel safe when I am with you." Vincent did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at his coffee for a brief moment, as though those simple words carried more weight than any business negotiation he had ever completed. When he finally looked up again, the calm expression Ethan had come to recognize remained, but there was unmistakable warmth behind it. Neither of them noticed the woman sitting near the opposite window quietly lowering her phone after taking a photograph of them smiling across the dinner table, a photograph that would be online before the night was over and would bring an entirely new wave of attention neither of them was expecting. The photograph spread across the internet before Ethan even reached his apartment. By sunrise the next morning, entertainment websites, business journals, and social media accounts were all sharing the same image of Vincent and Ethan smiling across a candlelit dinner table overlooking the river. The captions varied, but the message remained remarkably consistent. The city's most private businessman appeared happier than anyone had ever seen him. Ethan stared at his phone while eating breakfast, hardly believing that a quiet dinner had become headline news. His phone vibrated almost immediately. It was Vincent. "Please do not be alarmed by today's articles. Daniel is already handling the situation." Ethan smiled despite himself before replying. "I am beginning to think normal weekends no longer exist." Vincent answered with surprising speed. "I will try to return one to you eventually." Before Ethan could send another message, his phone rang. The caller identification displayed Ryan Carter's name. Ethan hesitated before rejecting the call. Less than a minute later, another call arrived from a different number. Then another. Finally, a text message appeared. "We need to talk. 5 minutes. That is all I am asking." Ethan placed the phone face down on the kitchen counter and walked toward the window, hoping the fresh morning sunlight would settle the growing uneasiness in his chest. At almost the same moment, Daniel stepped into Vincent's office carrying another folder. "The media coverage remains positive," he reported. "However, there is something else you should know." Vincent looked up from reviewing financial reports. "Go ahead." Daniel placed several printed pages on the desk. "Ryan Carter has contacted 3 reporters claiming your relationship with Mr. Brooks is fabricated. None of them published his statements because he offered no evidence." Vincent calmly turned another page. "Anything else?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. During our standard background review, we discovered something unusual." That sentence finally captured Vincent's complete attention. Daniel continued carefully. 5 years ago, Ethan Brooks volunteered at the Harbor Youth Arts Foundation during one of their community fundraising events. Vincent slowly looked up. "Continue." Daniel slid an old newspaper clipping across the desk. It showed a younger Ethan standing beside several volunteers during a charity exhibition. In the corner of the same photograph, partially obscured by the crowd, stood a younger Vincent speaking with event organizers before quietly leaving the stage. Vincent stared at the faded image much longer than expected. Daniel watched silently until Vincent finally spoke. "I remember that day." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You do?" Vincent nodded once. There was a sudden electrical failure during the presentation. Most people immediately walked outside. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph. One volunteer stayed behind to help elderly guests reach the exit safely before thinking about himself. Daniel looked more closely at the newspaper clipping. That volunteer was Ethan. Vincent smiled almost imperceptibly. "Yes." Memories returned with surprising clarity. Vincent remembered noticing the young Omega carrying folding chairs, offering bottled water, calming frightened children, and refusing public recognition afterward. At the time, Vincent had asked one organizer for the volunteer's name, intending to send a donation to the youth program in appreciation. The organizer had smiled apologetically and admitted nobody knew much about the quiet young volunteer who only appeared during weekend events. Life had continued. Meetings replaced memories. Years passed. Yet somehow that brief encounter had remained quietly stored in the back of Vincent's mind. Daniel broke the silence. "Would you like me to tell Mr. Brooks about this?" Vincent gently folded the newspaper clipping and returned it to the folder. "Not yet." "May I ask why?" Vincent walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Because I want to know whether he remembers me without being told." At that exact moment, Ethan's apartment buzzer sounded unexpectedly. Thinking it might be a grocery delivery, he walked downstairs and opened the front door. Standing on the sidewalk was a smiling elderly woman holding a small potted fern. "You probably do not remember me," she said warmly. "But years ago you volunteered at the Harbor Youth Arts Foundation. You helped my grandson feel welcome after his first art class. I saw your photograph in the news this morning and simply wanted to tell you that kindness has a remarkable way of finding its way back home." Ethan accepted the little plant with grateful surprise, completely unaware that the forgotten afternoon she mentioned had quietly connected his life with Vincent's long before either of them realized it. Monday morning arrived with an unexpected sense of calm. Ethan carried the small potted fern the elderly woman had given him onto the windowsill beside his apartment balcony, smiling every time he remembered her words. Kindness has a remarkable way of finding its way back home. He had no idea why the sentence continued echoing in his mind, but somehow it felt connected to everything that had happened since the charity gala. Just as he finished watering the little plant, his phone vibrated. It was Vincent. "Would you have lunch with me today?" Ethan smiled before replying. Only if this counts as a normal lunch and not another headline. Vincent answered almost immediately. I cannot promise the first part, but I will certainly try. 2 hours later they met at a quiet botanical garden cafe tucked inside one of the city's oldest public parks. Families wandered through flower gardens while children chased butterflies across open lawns. It felt worlds away from glittering charity galas and corporate boardrooms. Ethan relaxed almost immediately. I like this place, he admitted. Vincent nodded. Nobody comes here looking for business deals. As they walked along a shaded stone path carrying coffee, Ethan noticed Vincent greeting gardeners, volunteers, and elderly visitors by name. You know everyone here? Ethan asked. Not everyone, Vincent replied. But I helped fund the restoration project several years ago. I try to visit whenever I have time. Ethan looked around with renewed appreciation. That explains why everyone smiles when they see you. Vincent simply shrugged. Buildings matter. Communities matter more. Before Ethan could answer, a familiar voice interrupted from behind them. Well, this is convenient. Both men turned. Ryan Carter stood several yards away wearing sunglasses and an expression that suggested he had rehearsed this encounter. Ethan immediately felt the peaceful atmosphere disappear. Ryan removed his sunglasses and forced a pleasant smile. I only wanted 5 minutes. Vincent stepped slightly closer to Ethan, though his tone remained calm. I believe Ethan has already answered that request. Ryan ignored him and looked directly at Ethan. I made mistakes. I admitted that. But you cannot honestly expect people to believe this relationship happened overnight. Ethan took a slow breath. What people believe is not the most important thing anymore. Ryan frowned. Then what is? Ethan surprised even himself with the answer. How I feel when I wake up every morning. Ryan looked genuinely confused. Ethan continued quietly. For a long time I measured every decision by whether it would avoid conflict. Now I measure it by whether it gives me peace. The words hung in the air between them. Vincent said nothing, allowing Ethan to speak entirely for himself. Ryan lowered his eyes briefly before giving a tired sigh. So there is nothing left to fix. Ethan shook his head gently. No. I truly hope you find happiness, Ryan. But it is not going to be with me. For several silent seconds Ryan simply stood there. Then, to Ethan's surprise, his shoulders relaxed. I suppose hearing it this clearly was something I needed. He offered a small, bittersweet smile. Take care of yourself, Ethan. Without another argument, Ryan turned and slowly walked toward the park entrance until he disappeared among the trees. Ethan watched him leave, hardly believing the conversation had ended so peacefully. I expected that to be much more difficult, he admitted. Vincent smiled faintly. Sometimes people let go only after they realize they truly no longer have anything to hold on to. They continued walking through the gardens in comfortable silence until they reached a small pond where ducks drifted lazily across the water. Ethan glanced sideways at Vincent. Thank you. Vincent looked at him. For what? Ethan smiled. For standing beside me without speaking for me. Vincent's expression softened. You never needed someone to fight your battles, Ethan. You only needed someone who believed you could win them yourself. Ethan looked out across the quiet water, feeling lighter than he had in years. Neither of them noticed Daniel watching discreetly from a respectful distance after receiving an unexpected phone call. The investigation into Ethan's past had uncovered one final detail, a forgotten letter of appreciation written 5 years earlier in Vincent's own handwriting, addressed to an unnamed volunteer whose identity had remained unknown until now. Daniel quietly folded the document back into its envelope, realizing the truth Vincent had been searching for was even more extraordinary than either of them had imagined. The following Saturday, exactly 1 week after the charity gala had unexpectedly connected two strangers, Vincent invited Ethan to the Harbor Youth Arts Foundation. Ethan accepted without asking many questions, assuming they were attending another fundraising event together. The familiar brick building brought back memories the moment he stepped through the front gate. Fresh paint brightened the walls, colorful murals decorated the hallways, and children's laughter echoed through the classrooms just as it had years before. Ethan smiled without realizing it. "I used to volunteer here every weekend," he said quietly. Vincent watched him carefully. "I know." Ethan turned in surprise. "You know?" Vincent nodded and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket before removing a carefully preserved cream-colored envelope. Time had softened its edges, but the elegant handwriting across the front remained perfectly clear. Ethan accepted it with puzzled curiosity and slowly opened the flap. Inside rested a handwritten letter thanking an anonymous volunteer for extraordinary kindness shown during a community fundraiser 5 years earlier. Ethan read every line twice before looking back at Vincent in complete disbelief. "This was written by you?" Vincent smiled. "Yes." Ethan looked at the signature again. "But it was never mailed." Vincent let out a quiet breath. "Because I never learned your name." Ethan stared at him silently while Vincent continued. 5 years ago the power failed during a community event. Most people hurried outside. One volunteer stayed behind to help children. Elderly guests and families leave calmly before thinking about himself. I noticed. I asked the organizers who you were because I wanted to thank you properly. They could not tell me. They only knew that a quiet volunteer appeared every weekend without asking for recognition. Ethan looked around the familiar building as forgotten memories slowly returned. I remember that afternoon. Vincent nodded. I never forgot it. Ethan lowered his eyes to the letter still resting in his hands. Then, you recognized me before I recognized you. Not immediately, Vincent admitted. Only after Daniel completed the background review. When I saw the old newspaper photograph, everything came back. Ethan laughed softly, overwhelmed by the unbelievable coincidence. All this time I thought I had dragged a complete stranger into my problems. Vincent stepped a little closer, his voice remaining calm and sincere. You did not. Ethan looked up. Vincent smiled with quiet warmth. You simply ran toward someone whose life you had already touched years earlier. For several moments neither of them spoke. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, filling the room with gentle afternoon light while children laughed somewhere down the hallway. It felt strangely peaceful, as though the world had finally slowed down enough for both of them to understand how unexpectedly their paths had crossed. Ethan folded the letter carefully and handed it back. Vincent shook his head. Keep it. Ethan blinked. It belongs to you. No, Vincent replied. It was always meant for you. Ethan smiled, feeling emotion rise unexpectedly in his chest. There is something I should probably admit. Vincent waited patiently. Ethan laughed at himself before speaking. That night at the gala, when I grabbed your arm, I honestly believed you would ask security to escort me out. Vincent's eyes brightened with quiet amusement. I considered several responses. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Really? Vincent nodded once. Walking away was one possibility. What changed your mind? Vincent held Ethan's gaze for a long moment before answering. The moment you looked at me, I realized you were asking for safety, not attention. Then, after I remembered who you were, I understood something else. Ethan waited quietly. Vincent's smile became warmer than Ethan had ever seen before. The acting ended the moment Ryan walked away. Ethan felt his heart skip. Then why did you keep pretending? Vincent gently shook his head. Because after remembering the person you had always been, I realized I was no longer pretending. Ethan could not stop smiling. So our carefully planned arrangement was never really an arrangement. Perhaps at the beginning, Vincent admitted. But somewhere between morning messages, shared dinners, and quiet conversations, it became something honest. Ethan looked down at the little potted fern he had brought with him from home, deciding to donate it to the Foundation's new reading room. The elderly woman's words returned once again. Kindness has a remarkable way of finding its way back home. Ethan reached for Vincent's hand naturally this time, no fear, no performance, and no audience waiting to misunderstand the moment. Vincent gently held it without hesitation. Neither of them needed to play another role because the most unexpected story of their lives had begun with a desperate choice and ended with the simple truth that the safest place either of them had ever found was beside the other.